Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome officially to Friday, right before the weekend. Big weekend plans? No? No? It's raining? Yeah, well, it's going to rain a lot tomorrow, right? Yeah. Sunday's better, but yeah, it's going to be wet. But that's the thing, in Vancouver, if you're not going to do things because it's wet, then you're not going to do a lot of things. So we got to just suck it up and get out there. Although tomorrow I'm staying home all day. Not going out for any reason. But okay, so Kayla's here. Hello, good morning, Kayla. Let's jump in, okay? So yesterday we started talking about India, right? And so I walked you through, we're going to pay attention to that. I walked you through kind of the beginning of civilization in India, in the Indus River Valley. We said that there were kind of quite a number of smaller and larger cities kind of strung throughout the Indus River Valley. We said that it was a civilization that was based on intensive agriculture, and so they were growing wheat and as well as other kind of fruits and vegetables, and also had domesticated some animals as well, right? So cows and sheep and goats, but also elephants and buffaloes, right? They were using elephants and buffaloes as, to kind of help them with their heavy lifting, if you will. We said that the civilization kind of appears kind of around the same time as Mesopotamia. There might be some archaeological evidence that puts the Indus River Valley civilization a little bit earlier than Mesopotamia. But either way, they're both kind of developing at the same time. And because of the fact that we found kind of archaeological evidence in Mesopotamia that's actually from the Indus River Valley, we know that there was people going between the two, right? So they were trading or communicating with each other in some way, which again is pretty amazing, right? Thousands of years ago, and those two places are not close, right? Think of modern day Pakistan and modern day Iraq, right? Those countries are not side by side, and yet people were moving across that area and kind of communicating with each other. So we said that this was a kind of a technologically sophisticated civilization with kind of bronze tools. They created their own writing script, and we kind of imagine that there was some sort of centralized power, okay? So we don't know if it was a king or a priest or priest king or who it was, but someone seemed to be in charge of this civilization and was kind of ensuring that it operated in kind of a standardized way, right? So we see evidence of consistent weights and measures, which you usually need a central authority to enforce, right? You need some kind of government to tell people, this is the standard length of measurement, this is the standard of weight, you must use it or else, right? So you usually need some sort of centralized power to do that. But yeah, we suspect somebody was in charge. But again, because we can't read any of their script, we're not really sure what was going on, right? We don't know who was in power. We don't know why they were in power. There's a lot we don't know, right? So I showed you some impressive pictures here. I think of Mohenjo-Daro, which is one of the cities in the Indus River Valley. Showed you that picture as well. Yeah, this is some of the things here with intensive agriculture and their script. I showed you some plans of the city where you could see a lot of different buildings kind of chained together, but a big kind of central avenue, if you will, going up the side. And Harappa is built the same way, right, with a big avenue on one side. We said that this civilization also, in addition to building cities, also had a pretty nifty sanitation system, right? So a series of kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Canals, passageways, chutes, something under the sidewalk blocks that allowed sewage to leave the city, right? can't find the right word this morning. But they did have this kind of sewer system, if you will. And again, that's pretty significant. You're not going to see that again until the Roman Republic, which is going to be, a good 2,000 years later. So these guys were really ahead of their time in terms of sanitation. I showed you this, maybe a typical house in one of these Indus River Valley civilization cities, where you can see kind of a central courtyard and then sort of 2 levels of rooms built around it. A little bit about the sewer system. And so I had some pictures of maybe what that looked like. Pretty smart, pretty ingenious, and lots of work to create. So we said that this civilization flourished for quite some time, probably at least 1,000 years, maybe more. But around about 1800 BC, so about 3,800 years ago, the civilization starts to kind of disappear, right? People start leaving the cities and moving off into other parts of the landscape. Again, we're not entirely sure what's going on, although shortly we may have some more answers to that. But what also happens around this time is, as people are leaving these cities, in comes these new people, right, who we're calling the Indo-Aryans, right? And yesterday I asked you some questions about them. I asked you to read a section of the textbook, and you told me some important things about these Indo-Aryans, right? So you told me that they were not from India, they were from further to the, yeah.
They come from like something like Pakistan, Afghanistan mountain.
Yeah.
They come from there and then they stay in India.
Yeah, so they found their way in through kind of Afghanistan, Pakistan, through the mountains, and found their way into northern India, right? So they're kind of not really from India, but they kind of enter that territory at this time, and they'll stay, right? Again, they're going to sort of set the basis for Indian civilization to come, right? So there's this Indus River Valley thing that happens for 1,000 years. Then that's kind of over. And then the Indo-Aryans come in, and kind of a new period of cultural development begins. We said that we know these people mostly from their hymns, right? So they had a book of hymns called the Rig Veda, and it has all of these kind of prayers and songs to the gods. And because we can read that, because it's written in what language?
Sanskrit?
Yeah, because it's written in Sanskrit, which is kind of a earlier form of Hindi and Bengali and so forth. Because we can read it, we can learn some things about these people, right? We can learn things about how they sort of found their way into this part of the world. We learn a little bit about their subsistence strategy, right? The fact that they herded cows, but also grew some of their own food. We also learn a little bit about their family structure, right? You told me that they were living in kind of extended family groups. You told me that it seemed like men were kind of in charge, right? And they were passing their property on to their sons, right? And so it was really important for the Indo-Aryans to have sons in their family, because that's how they would pass down their wealth and their kind of status. What else do I have here? Yeah, we hear a little more about the sort of honor of the ancestors, the importance of herding, and we hear a little bit about their religious life as well, right? And so, again, keep in mind that these Vedas were probably passed down for hundreds, maybe even thousands of years, right? But they were passed down orally, right? They were memorized, and people taught them to their children and to their grandchildren, and so on and so forth. Finally, they get written down much later, but again, they serve as they serve as the basis for what we know about these Indo-Aryans, and kind of the first evidence, written evidence we have of, what will eventually become Indian religion and Indian kind of culture. So I've kind of talked about that. The Rig Veda, you told me that it also tells us a little bit about Indo-Aryan religion. So we heard that there were many gods. I think 33 was the number, although maybe more. It's hard to know. The Vedas talk about the composition of the universe with the earth and the sky and underworld. The Vedas talk about demons that are responsible for helping humans or causing them trouble, right? And the fact that sometimes you have to pray to them in order to get some assistance. And then we heard of a couple of the important gods as well, right? And Indra is probably the most important one, the god of the sky, the god of the storm, but also kind of a warrior, protector, heroic kind of figure, right? Almost like Horus in a way, right? If you remember from ancient Egypt, Horus is kind of a heroic god as well, although he's associated more with the sun in Egypt. Here, Indra is associated more with the storm and the rain, right? It's a very Indra-like day we have today, if you will. So, yes. So that was our base point. And so I have a little section of a documentary to show you, which is super fascinating. It's called The Story of India. And so we'll watch kind of the first 20 minutes or so, and some of the things it will tell us are things that we've already heard about. So it'll tell us a little bit about the Indus River Valley civilization. It will tell us a little bit about the Indo-Aryans, but we'll also get to see some of this stuff, right? We'll actually get to go to some of these places and kind of get a better feel for what's going on. So we'll hear and see some things that we've already talked about. We'll also hear and see some new things as well, okay? So, whoops, that's not the right button. So while we're watching, I have these in Microsoft Teams for you. But a few questions. So the first one is, in what way does India preserve an unbroken thread of human history? Really interesting. What is so interesting about the mantras and the chants that the Brahmins are using? So we'll meet some Brahmins, some kind of they're kind of priests or holy people, and they'll be engaged in these religious chants, and there's something very interesting about them. Something that geneticists are discovering about villagers in rural India. So there's kind of a genetic component there. Question 4, why were early scholars surprised that India and Pakistan could have an ancient civilization in their past? So again, the Mesopotamian civilizations we knew about, in Western science anyway, they knew about for a long time. Ancient Egypt was pretty well known, but the Indus River Valley civilization was kind of discovered much later, and it kind of surprised scholars when it appeared. So I'm asking you, why is that? How many people might have lived in the Indus River Valley Empire? I'll ask you that. And what might have led to the end of the Indus River Valley civilization, and where did the people go, right? So I said that civilization kind of declined and people seemed to leave the cities. This documentary will have a bit of an explanation about how and why that might have happened. Okay? Coolio? Yeah? It's never bad having a little documentary on a Friday, right? Rainy Friday. Documentary. You know? Okay. So, online people, the questions and the link is in Microsoft Teams, of course. And so we'll watch. We've got, as you can see here, I want you to watch the first 26 minutes of it. So we'll watch 26 minutes, then we'll take a break and talk about what we've seen after that. Okay, so I'll turn you loose, and we'll see you after the break. come back and talk about what we've seen, okay? All right, so we are back. Interesting part of the world, right? This place is on my, I think this is on my travel list. I would like to go there, although I think it would be very intimidating and there'd be a lot of things happening and it might be a kind of a stressful trip, but I think it'd be really neat to visit India. But anyway, let me ask you some questions here. In what way does India preserve an unbroken thread of human history?
They still do the ritual from the first human migration.
Okay.
The chants, prayers, and stuff. All of the rituals.
Right, so there's a little bit about migration, but also the preservation of those chants, right? Veda, what were you going to say?
They pass it down through orally through generations from father to child.
Yeah, so there's this kind of, there's this passing down of kind of,
From generation to generation.
yeah, this oral information, which we'll save because we're going to talk about that shortly. But yeah, I think that's what the host is talking about here, the idea that, humans evolved in Africa, at first around 300,000 years ago, and then around 80,000 years ago or so, we started to move out, right? And we started to move into other parts of the world. And one of the first places that humans came to was southern India. And it seems like they remained there, right? They stayed in southern India. So, yeah, this is kind of an unbroken thread, and that this was like a first stop for people who had migrated out of Africa, and then people continued to sort of spread throughout the world, from Africa and from there. And so the host is saying that really, some of the people that we saw in the video are related to the very first Indians, which is amazing. But also, in another way, we're all related to the very first Indians, right? Because there's a bit of a lineage differentiation between the humans, the Homo sapiens that stayed in Africa, and the ones that left. And so most of us are related to the ones that left. And they started out in India. And so the Indians are kind of related to them, but a little more distantly, so are we all, right? Which is pretty amazing. So number 2 here, we're talking about these mantras, right? These chants that the Brahmins are saying. And you said that they were passed down for a long period of time, but what else did we learn about those chants? Yeah, what were they? What was? Try and give me a little bit more around that, because.
Rules and patterns, but there's no meaning. That's sound.
Yeah.
And it's like they cannot write it down, so like they need to pass it off orally.
Yeah. Yeah. So these chants and mantras that these holy guys are saying over and over again, they're not in. It's not in their language, right? And it's not in Sanskrit either. It seems to be older, right? And it doesn't seem to, linguists kind of listen to it and try to figure it out, but it's not in any known language, and it doesn't really follow the rules of language either, right? It doesn't follow the rhythm of it. And he's saying that some scientists feel that it most closely resembles the song of a bird, right? So it's a chant that's not really. It's almost like it's not really from the human world, like it comes from before that. And so he's almost suggesting that it comes from before language, right? Before we had, a symbolic language like we all have nowadays. This is maybe something that's even pre-language, right? So, we're probably talking. Yeah, we're talking tens of thousands of years old that these have been passed down for that long, which is, if that's true, that's unbelievable, right? This is like the oldest record of human communication ever, right? It predates every language that we currently understand, and it probably goes back further to a point where language wasn't really even language, right? Where we were communicating with each other, but not in a sort of complicated language like we do today. So this is wild, right? Like this is the oldest record of human communication anywhere, right? This goes back before writing, before Sanskrit, maybe even before that sort of Proto-Indo-European language that we'd heard about. This might go way back, right? Which again is just mind-blowing, right? And these guys have passed it down from generation to generation. And you could see it happening, right? You could see that one Brahmin priest, right? And he was sitting with that little boy who was being trained as a Brahmin, and he's saying, okay, recite it again, right? And the Brahmin is listening to make sure the boy's got it right, and if he doesn't, he'll correct him, and he'll have to do it again, right? And this is how they've been able to preserve it and pass it down, right? By teaching it this way. Unbelievable. Yeah, Brahmins are kind of, we'll get a proper definition for Brahmins later. In this context, they're kind of a class of holy people, yeah, like a priest, someone who is a religious practitioner. Yeah. So again, we'll talk more about Brahmins a little bit later, but yeah, that's correct. Yeah, what did geneticists find about the villagers in India?
Do you have first in genetics and M130?
Yeah, they're looking for the M130 gene. Why are they looking for that one?
It's first human.
Yeah, it's a marker, right? For the first human populations to come to India from Africa had the M130 gene. And interestingly, almost that whole village has that gene, right? And what does that mean?
They all continue.
They all what?
All are human.
Yeah, they're all related, right? People came to that part of the world and they stayed there, and then their ancestors stayed there, and their ancestors stayed there, or their children stayed there, and their children's children. And so that group of people and their ancestors have been living in that very part of the world for 60 or 70,000 years. Unbelievable, right? Unbelievable. How long have most of you been in this part of the world? A month, 2 months, maybe a year, maybe 2 years, right? My family's been in this part of the world for about 110 years, give or take. So can you imagine a group of people living in the same place going back 70,000 years? Unbelievable, right? It's almost unbelievable, but yeah, here it's happening, right? When they first discovered Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa and some of these Indus River Valley civilizations, scholars were kind of surprised to find these things in India and Pakistan. Why were they surprised? Why were they surprised? Don't know? Well, the video was explaining that, I guess, it comes down to ethnocentrism, right? Remember ethnocentrism? Where you kind of judge other cultures by your own kind of values, right? And so the British had colonized India, and the British kind of clearly thought they were better than the Indians, right? They thought they were more sophisticated, more intelligent, and they kind of had the belief that civilization came from the West, right? It came from Mesopotamia, and then it came from Egypt, it came from Rome, and then eventually it came to Europe, right? And so civilization and progress and technology their idea was that all of that came from the West, right? And so here, shockingly, they discover a complex civilization that is just as old as Egypt and Mesopotamia, right? And so here these, British colonists were looking down on the Indians, but the Indians have a great civilization in their own past, right? Just like they do in the West. And so, yeah, they were kind of surprised, but it was kind of a bit of an ethnocentric thing, maybe even a little bit of a racist thing, right? For them to look at the Indians and look down on them and say, oh, these people could never have such a great civilization. And then it turns out that in fact they do, right? Sadly, we can't read the writing because then we'd really, we'd be able to learn a lot more about it. But they have a great civilization in their past as well. They were talking about how many people might have lived in this part of the world at the height of this Indus River Valley civilization.
210,000.
Yeah, in the city of Harappa for sure, but how about in the entire region? Did you catch it? Yeah, 5 million people, right? That is massive. Can you imagine that?
Oh, at that time?
Yeah.
No, I can't.
Unbelievable. Well, yeah, it's unbelievable. What do we have in the Lower Mainland here? 2.5 million, I think, if you count like Richmond and Burnaby, and if you count all of this stuff. I think we've got about 2.5 million people in the Lower Mainland here. That's twice as many people living in this part of the world, right? Maybe even under a single ruler, right? A single king. Huge, right? For this time in history, that is a massive empire, right? Unbelievably big. But then, of course, as we read and as I told you, and then as we learned in the documentary, it kind of ends, right? People kind of abandon these cities that they've built, these cities that have been flourishing for 1,000 years or more, and they kind of move off. And why is that? Climate change? Okay, how does that work?
Oh, so like they follow the river to the east.
Why is the river moving? Rivers don't move, do they? What happens?
They found a new outlet, a new place, a new land to live, following the river to the east.
Yeah, and why does the river move?
Climate
Change.
Yeah, okay. Can you give me a little bit more than that? Climate change, yes, but
Why the river move?
yeah.
Monsoons.
Yeah, the monsoons, right? The seasonal rains that come to that part of the world, right? The climate changes, weather patterns change. The monsoon is not as heavy as it used to be, right? Which is interesting because a similar thing happened in Egypt, right? Remember how because of climate change, the areas around further away from the river dried up, right? And people had to move in closer to the Nile. Here, the monsoon changed. It became lighter than it used to be. And so the river started to move, right? It found new channels to occupy. And so people who had built their cities and their canals and their farms right next to the river, suddenly the river is slowly disappearing, right? Every year it's lower and lower, right? Every year the canals and the irrigation dikes, they don't fill with water. You can't water your crops anymore, right? And so because the river starts to move, because the water starts to go somewhere else, the cities dry up, right? And people have to leave. They have to find other places to farm, right? And so we saw some pretty interesting work done with satellite imagery, right? Where you can, if you were just standing there looking at it, you'd never see it. But from a satellite image, you can see where the river used to be, right? On the ground, it doesn't look like anything. It just looks like a jungle, right? But on the satellite image, you can see the old riverbed, and you can see that all of those ancient cities were right along the river. And then when the river moved, people had to move too, right? You need the water, and if the water stops flowing, You have to move, right? And so those people do move. And so again, it's really interesting how often climate comes up, right? It either comes up in terms of a stimulus and response, right? Encouraging people to cooperate. Sometimes it kind of pushes people one way or the other, right? Certain areas become too wet or too dry, and people are forced to move to other areas, right? So as the climate is changing, people are constantly being pushed around, right? From one part of the landscape to the other. And as we'll, spoiler alert, as we'll find out, the Indo-Aryans, who are going to show up in sort of northwestern India and Pakistan, they're going to be moving because of climate change as well, right? So they don't show up in that part of the world just because they were bored and they thought they'd go for a walk. They were moving as well, right? The climate was pushing them into new lands. And so as the sort of global climate changes, people have to move around and adapt, right? And so we see kind of the flourishing of a civilization, and then we kind of see it disappear, right? As people are forced to move and kind of start again, right? And so they do. We get kind of a restart or a reset or a reboot, whatever you want to call it. But Indian civilization kind of reboots itself around 18 or 1700 BC. Right? And so this will be the foundation for things that come later. Man, that's interesting, isn't it? There's some unbelievable stuff. No?
Not really. But the fantastic thing is like all like so many people living in
The
one
same-
place,
yeah, one
and they are
place.
not going to like, separate out.
And they're not
So
going to?
separate out. So they stay together, and they extend their generation.
People live in the same place. Like,
So many people, and they, no one is going to.
Well, it's also a big place, right? Like if we look at, what slide am I on? 26. If we look at, yeah, like that's a big part of the world, right? So if we say that 5 million people live there, that's a huge amount of people for this time in history. But that's also a pretty large area of land, right? So it wouldn't be as nearly as kind of as sort of densely populated as we are here. But for the ancient world, huge, right? Tons and tons of people. So yeah, 5 million is a lot. They're also spread out quite a bit, but even when they're spread out, it's still a lot, right? Especially for this time and place. Anything else that sort of struck you as interesting or strange or not strange or
Voice.
the what?
Their voice.
Their voice?
They practice the local language.
Oh yeah, wild, right?
Like some of them they didn't know what is the meaning of it.
It's a communication to the gods, right?
But they don't, if they don't know the meaning, they have maybe lost for like so many years. They appear before they have the human speech.
Yeah, really cool. And sometimes, sometimes the meaning of things isn't important. Like in Europe, for the longest time, they used to do Catholic masses used to be done in Latin because that was sort of the language of scholars, the language of priests, the language that things were written in. But most people actually didn't speak Latin. So they would go to church and they would, listen to all the prayers, but they actually didn't really know what they were saying because everything was in a language they didn't speak. So sometimes you have that situation where, it's not so important about being able to know everything. You just have to know that it's, that it's a sacred thing, right? Yeah, super interesting, but beautiful, right? Beautiful country, unbelievable. Okay, let me just see where I am here. Right. Would you like to watch a bit more? Yeah?
yeah, sure.
Yeah, sure. Okay? All right. So the next little bit is this piece here, okay? So I'm just going to pop this into Microsoft Teams. Same link, of course, because it's the same video. There we go. Same link. So again, we'll hear a little bit about William Jones. He's a, I think he's British, a British guy who is taught how to read Sanskrit by a Brahmin priest. Okay, so he makes a little discovery after that, and I'll ask you how he does it. What do we learn about Aryans from these early written sources? So this is talking about the Rig Veda and how we know about these early Indo-Aryans, okay? He'll talk a little bit about Soma, which was very briefly mentioned in the textbook, but we'll hear a little bit more about it, and what its use is. He'll take us to an archaeological excavation in Turkmenistan, which is kind of in Central Asia, and they'll talk about another abandoned city, similar to the Indus River Valley ones. And then, yeah, the significance of that. Why is that important? Sound good? Okay, let's do it. Questions are in Microsoft Teams. Link is in Microsoft Teams. And we're going to go from 2611 to 4715, as you can see, okay? So online people will see you after 20 minutes or so, okay? second here. So I'll stop it there just because we're kind of going to start to run out of time. But just very quickly, what does William Jones discover after he's taught Sanskrit by this Brahmin priest?
Similar words with Latin and Greek.
Yeah, which would be totally unexpected, right? Like, wouldn't it be weird to be looking through this and to say, hey, I know this word. It's the same as in Latin, which is the language of the Roman Empire, right? Which is thousands of miles away, right? And ancient Greek, the same thing, right? And so finds all of these words, and they're similar, right? And what does that suggest to him and to us?
Connection.
Yeah, there's a connection, but what kind of connection? Yeah, like back in time connection, right? So those languages, Sanskrit and Latin and Greek, they all have some relative language in the past, right? They have a grandfather or a great-grandfather language in common, right? And so those languages have kind of been given birth to later, if you will, but they have some sort of common origin, right? Which again is surprising and cool because you really wouldn't think that those languages are related, right? They're geographically they're a long way apart, and Latin comes a lot later, right? Sanskrit is older than Latin and ancient Greek. It's an older language, but still there's a relationship between them, right? What did we learn about? We kind of have answered this question, but did we hear anything else about what we know about the Aryans from the Vedas, from the Rig Veda? Those little pieces of paper were 700 years old, right? Yeah, they called themselves Aryans, which were the civilized ones, right? Spoiler alert, every culture thinks that they're the civilized ones. But what?
I'm sorry. What do you mean by civilized?
Like, sophisticated. We're better than those people over there, right? In the hills or whatever. And again, every civilization, every society thinks they're better than everybody else. So, the Aryans, it's not surprising they thought they were more sophisticated than other people. But yeah, so they're the sophisticated, the civilized ones. They're Aryan or Arya. What else do we learn? Yeah, we hear kind of some geographical references, right, to rivers and passes that they may have found their way through, right? That's very interesting. And then we also hear about Soma, right? And what's Soma? Yeah. 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 Did you hear what the sort of active ingredient in the Soma is? It's this little plant that grows kind of up in the mountains. They make a tea out of it and they drink it.
It tastes bitter.
Yeah, it tastes kind of bitter, but what it has in it is ephedrine. Do you know what ephedrine is?
No.
It's a stimulant.
Means something that gets like caffeine or what thing?
Yeah, this is a stimulant. Caffeine is a stimulant, as is ephedrine. So if you drink it, you get a little buzz, right?
Coffee?
What's that?
If I take coffee.
Yeah, no, well, caffeine is a stimulant as well. So yeah, so in coffee you have caffeine, that's kind of the active ingredient. In Soma you have ephedrine, which is
Ephedrine is something that like give some more dopamine to our brain.
yeah,
To get happy.
yeah. It kind of wakes you. Well, it's like caffeine. It wakes you up, gives you a little bit of a buzz, right? Makes you a little more you know, a little more ready to go kind of thing. That's what the Soma does. These people were, and again, it's mentioned in the Rig Veda, so people were drinking this stuff probably thousands of years ago, right? Incredible, and it's mentioned right there. Okay, so that's all the time I think we have. We'll deal with this excavation in Turkmenistan on Monday. Until then, have a great weekend. Try to stay dry. It's going to be wet tomorrow. No? Yes?
Yes.
Yes. It's a Netflix day. Just stay in bed. Okay, have a good weekend, guys, and I'll see you on Monday, okay?
Thank
Okay.
you. See you on Monday.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.